Percy with an early run, he's onside this time! It's 1-1! Andre Schürrle, it's 7! It's Mario Götze! What a goal! What a goal to win a World Cup!
There's been a lot that's gone on in this World Cup. There's been a lot of events that have transpired in which they sort of supersede everything else, and games which you kind of want to focus on them and nothing else. And I've had to sit down and go, do you know what, I want to cover everything, regardless of the fact that there's one match that's the big story, regardless of the fact that there's one team doing more so either better or worse than everything else, and that alone would cover 15 minutes of a reaction podcast. This is the Beermat World Cup podcast. Earlier this afternoon, ultimately, was very much what we expected. Sweden 1, Switzerland 0. The goal itself wasn't of any real great quality. The game itself, very much a representation of that. Switzerland came out and had a go after half time. You would argue that Sweden were the better side. Realistically speaking, you could have flipped a coin and whoever won that coin flip could have gone through. And I'm not saying that to be a dickhead, I'm saying that because that was the way it was reflected in the play. Switzerland flatter to deceive when they're winning, so when they're behind, you can only imagine what you're going to get. And for those that actually watched the game, you know what I'm talking about. For those that didn't, you can literally only imagine. Shaqiri being here, there and everywhere without any real great quality. I think the one good chance came to defender and he headed it straight at the goalkeeper. And then obviously, and I'm not going to get on these players' backs, but like Granit Xhaka seemed to, he's got his hands full with Phil Neville, so he doesn't need me slagging him off. I didn't think he was necessarily terrible or great. Apparently he's at fault for the goal, even though it's very preventable. I think the problem is him showing him inside. Okay, yeah, sometimes you read the idea that the guy's going to have a go at goal. You think to yourself, he's going to shoot, so I'll put my body on the line. And a lot of that manifests itself in the idea of, like, you just turn your back, you just try and block it. There are some sort of hard-knock defenders that just stand up front it, face it, get kicked in the head, and they've generally got concussion and can't play for the next 4 days. So I have no problem with this as a thing. It's just a thing. But the idea that him turning his back on it is the whole reason for the goal. Maybe he's one of a list of characters that may be responsible, but to say that he's responsible for the whole thing, it feels like a terrible Michael Bay film. He's one person, but there are other people to blame as well. There are a couple of things I do actually want to get to in terms of the game itself, because obviously a football game did transpire in spite of the fact that if you watched it you wouldn't have even necessarily known that. First and foremost, there are a couple of moments late on, one specifically that has nothing to do with the score, has nothing to do with the play and anything in general, but it's just a really big bugbear of mine that did actually happen in the England-Colombia game as well, but it felt like when Denmark were pressing and this instance happened to sort of manifest itself, it really annoyed me, because you see this all the time, and I really think there's a very simple rule change to stop this from happening again, which is Denmark were on the break, the ball appeared to go out of play. When I say appeared to go out of play, what I mean is it was on the line. The whole of the ball wasn't over the line. But obviously the crowd appeals, the players appeal, the referee gives the throw. I'm not suggesting that we need to get VAR for throw-ins because that's going too far. But what annoys me so much is this idea of, like, the whole of the ball needs to go out for it to be a throw. But how many times have you watched a game of football, whether it be in this World Cup or whether it be in domestic football, whatever you've seen over the last 12 months, if not 5 years, where as soon as the ball touches the touchline, quite literally the touchline, it's given as a throw? I'm getting to a point now where I just think, can we not just change it to, let's just have it as a throw-in if it touches the paint? Because this whole idea of the whole of the ball has to go out is never the case. Or even a case of like, let's just change it to if some of the ball goes over the line. Because realistically, what we're doing right now isn't the rules. And it happens every game, at least 3 or 4 times. Next thing I want to get to is the ending of the game, which was eerily similar to what we saw in the Denmark-Croatia game, whereby a Sweden player goes through, he's taken out, and a Switzerland player sees red. Initially it was given as a penalty, it was rescinded, and it was given as a free kick. I'm curious to see if this happens earlier on in the game, because realistically this was the last kick of the game. Regardless of whether it was a penalty or a free kick, Sweden have won. Could have, aside from the really random suggestion whereby your boy turns around and kicks it into his own goal, this was definitely happening. So I want to know if this happens earlier on in the game and you rescind the idea of it being a penalty to a free kick, how often will the card get changed? The referee in this instance seemed to suggest that the card wouldn't be changed because it was definitely a professional foul. I think there's a huge difference in between the foul that was made in Denmark-Croatia versus this one. I'm not even sure it is a foul. Sweden player goes down well too early. Sweden player actually does really well to get himself, as he's put through, between the defender and the ball and the goal. It feels very soft. Once you give that, it's really hard to sort of rescind the red. And in the last minute, that's fine. But if that happens in the first 10, I think that's where we could have problems. And again, Sweden advance, Switzerland do not. It's neither here nor there. I'm just sort of, I'd like clarification, if nothing else. What I don't need clarification on is England's penalty record. And what I don't need clarification on is England's World Cup record. And what I don't need clarification on is this idea that England will not have a better chance of going through to the final, if not winning this tournament. Colombia won. England won. England, if you can imagine the sentence that's about to leave my lips, win on penalties. The game itself was not that dissimilar to what you would have expected. I think at the end of the first half, with the Henderson headbutt, Colombia, I mean, it was their tactics anyway, but they realised and they had this idea of, hang on, the more we do this, the more it seems to disrupt their play. And for, I would say, 120 minutes, Colombia did very little. But I would also say is that the longer that game went on, England did less. And so Colombia's plan seems to work. You draw your opponent, and in this instance, and regardless of what your allegiances are, it's a team of lesser quality against a team of superior quality into your sort of web of fouls and bullshit. And the longer that goes on, the more you've got a chance. And there are so many sort of indicators of the old England, if you want to call it that, and this England, if you want to call it that, that are fascinating. The old England, this is exactly the whole way the game transpires, aside from winning on penalties, is everything I've seen from this side, even though none of these players played for them when I first started watching it back in Euro 96. The thing that fascinates me is that the game management was actually really good, I would say. From the penalty to the end of the game. Aside from, obviously, that one bullshit incident, what normally tends to happen in England games, especially in big tournaments, is that England start off really well. Most of the time take a lead, actually. And then it becomes a case of, like, they shit the bed because they can't keep the ball, they can't take pressure, and it all seems to sort of collapse on them like a house of cards. Now, what happened after the goal was there was a lot of feigning injury, as it were. Gamesmanship. Even before the goal, Harry Maguire's dive is as bad as I've seen from an England player since the last time England played. Yeah, you thought I was going to go with really a long time ago there, but I've got a newsflash for you. England players dive all the time. It's just never brought up. And this dive won't be brought up again. But I'm fine with it. If that's what you want to do, get through. Again, fine. So long as it doesn't affect the side that I'm supporting. And that sort of brings me into this whole loop before we finish. I wouldn't consider myself an England fan. I grew up watching around me a side divided as it became the golden generation, and this idea of I have to support players that I don't like on a weekly basis. And I'm not suggesting that it divided the fan base, not at all, but I just think me specifically being part of that in terms of the players that were in there, Gerrard, Heskey, Owen, you could go on. And also as well, just England in general. You see the fans abroad singing about this, doing that. And we've seen none of this World Cup, so I'm not suggesting that this is anywhere near to do with what I'm saying. I did worry going into this tournament that the current political climate would have me at odds with the idea that I want this side to do well, because I actually kind of do. And I still haven't celebrated a goal as much as I would my own club side. And that's neither here nor there, really. That doesn't really matter. I'm just using that as a line, because there will come a point where I will. And also, in that regard, I haven't celebrated a goal in normal time. What I did do was I nearly flipped my table over with Pickford's second save. That meant a lot. And that meant a lot, not because I care that much about England, but because football is so much more than allegiances and dividing lines. It's about moments. It's about believing. It's about hope. It's about knowing what can possibly go wrong and then that not happening. It's about the idea that in 10, 20, 30 years' time, I'll look back on any particular given night, this particular given night, and say, yeah, I remember that. That was amazing. That was great. And that cuts aside all politics. That cuts aside all the club stuff. And you know what? When it comes down to the latter stages, the politics of it all may be a heavier anchor than the moment. But I said before the tournament started that I just wanted to see, because realistically speaking, whether I want England to win this World Cup or not, how many times am I going to see this? How many times am I going to see the people sitting to my left and to my right enjoying themselves to a level, to this euphoria? And like, at that point, it doesn't matter whether I care or not. This country, for all its flaws, is obsessed with football. I am obsessed with football. If nothing else, we come together on that alone. And the fact that we get to do it all again on Saturday brings a massive smile to my face. This has been the Beermat World Cup podcast. The group stage is done. The round of 16 is done. There are 8 teams left in the greatest tournament of them all, in the greatest World Cup I've ever seen of them all. It doesn't matter what happens from now on in. This has already been worth it.